I'll just start in New Hampshire because it's sort of the news of the moment. Um, yeah, I guess we're down to the wire, but it would appear that Haley will finish second. But run through the scenario, if you would, David, that is relevant to how
Well,
this New
I
Hampshire
think
thing
that
plays out.
yeah, Mark, I think there are two very important things to watch for tonight in New Hampshire. Let me go back to the caucuses last week in Iowa to make them clear. There was a very low turnout in the Iowa caucuses, 40% below 2016, the last time there was a contested caucus in Iowa. Trump only got a tad more than half of the caucus voters. So that shows that Iowa Republicans were very deeply divided. Many of them were just, I don't want to go out. And this nonsense about it was too cold to go out is absurd. Anybody who's lived in the Midwest, or even where I live in Western New York, used to live in Michigan, that doesn't deter people from getting out. Terrible storms can, but not cold per se. And in fact, there were journalists who reported that bars and bowling alleys and restaurants were doing gangbuster business that night. So the results there showed that Trump's support, while very, very deep, is not broad, and he's vulnerable. In New Hampshire, what you want to look for are how big is the turnout and how well does Haley do. The smaller the turnout, the more likely Trump is to benefit because his hardcore supporters are absolutely going to turn out. The better Haley does, then it shows more anti-Trump sentiment among Republicans. Now, you can register as a Republican on the day of the voting in New Hampshire. So if Trump doesn't do well, he's going to say, oh, we're all Democrats, liberal Democrats, voting as Republicans. There'll be some analysis that will tell you that. It may take a day or two from people who are very into the weeds of voting. But if Nikki Haley gets over 40%, that should be very troubling to Trump. And if the vote turnout is very small, that will tend to favor Trump. If it's large, it's going to tend to favor Nikki Haley. So it'd be important to pay attention to the size of the turnout. All of this matters. I fully expect Trump is going to be the party's nominee. I don't think the party leaders have thought through what happens if Trump is convicted of any felony between now and next November. But hopefully the primary will not end tonight. It will continue at least through Super Tuesday, so we get a broader gauge of just how strong or weak Trump's support is.
The last thing that David just said is so key, and I hadn't even thought of it, which is let's use these as data points, how this continues, how broad his support is, how deep his support is. So here's the question. Will Haley stay? This is from Ren. Will Haley stay in the race in case something happens to Trump?
I think so. I think Trump will, candidates no longer say they're quitting the race. They say they're suspending their race so they can try to come back if something happens.
I see.
And one of the reasons I think it's important that this continue at least through Super Tuesday is in a number of recent appearances, Trump's mental decline is so clearly on display. He lashed at length into Nikki Haley for what she failed to do on January 6th in Washington. Presumably he meant Nancy Pelosi, but certainly everything he said about Nikki Haley was just bonkers. And NPR this morning Steve Inskip did a piece about 4 different Trump rallies in a row, 4 nights in a row, where they analyzed the entire hour-long monologues. And they're just getting crazier and crazier. There have to be people, even Trump people, who are recognizing that Donald's mental state is really in very severe decline.
Yeah, the confusion with Haley and Pelosi was such a prominent one, such a high-profile one, and then he continued it. It wasn't just a little slip. He said, I offered Nikki Haley, 10,000 troops to, and she turned it down or whatever. He was clearly, as you say, mixing it, but it wasn't like a little slip. He continued on that line. So as you say, his decline is, and the mental acuity issue, even I would suggest, maybe off the table for MAGA, right? I mean, they play that card a lot when talking about Biden.
I think that the very most dedicated followers, who you can see in television interviews saying things like, we had the greatest economic expansion in history under Trump, which is utter nonsense. And we had the most job creation, utter nonsense. We had peace in the world, utter nonsense. The super diehards, yes, but there are a lot of people who are Trump supporters who I think are also rational people, and as if this continues for a month or so, I think there'll be more examples of Donald's serious mental decline. Now, I noticed that one of the people in here, Delwood Kelp, which I assume is a made-up name, says, "What about Joe Biden's decline?" None of the people around Joe Biden see any decline in his mental capacity. He has, without a teleprompter, been able to speak very effectively off the cuff. He had the same majority, actually one vote smaller majority in the House during the first 2 years of his administration, and he got all these major bills passed. And the Democrats now don't have a majority, but the Republicans have been unable to act as a single party because they're in such disarray. And there's no evidence, if you watch Joe Biden, of anything other than sharp mental acuity. He has some verbal tics because he stuttered as a child, and everybody who has overcome stuttering has various verbal tics, little odd mannerisms, and tends to pick the wrong word. Not unlike, I often refer to my 8 children by number because I run through the list sometimes, calling one of them by every name. And as one of my children one day said, "Well, there's one thing we know, Dad doesn't have a second family." And I said, "Why is that?" She said, "Because you'd have to have 5 girls and 3 boys with the same names."
Yeah.
But it's a little
Just
odd.
higher numbers,
my
though.
grandmother used to always say when she would do that, "I love you all equally." That's why. There's just no indication that Biden is anything other than perfectly sharp. And go look at the videos of him doing push-ups with school children, riding his 10-speed bike when he wears a short sleeve shirt instead of a suit. I mean, this guy is, for a man who's 80 years old, he's ripped.
He's absolutely in better shape than I am, and the walking and cycling that he does is it puts me to shame. I mean, literally, no exaggeration. The guy I find quite impressive. But I also
and
think
by the way, when have you ever seen Donald Trump ride a 10-speed bicycle or do a push-up?
Right. Well, I mean, different deal, and I do have a question for you, and it's something that really is. It never really makes it into, I guess, the conversation, but maybe it does make it into people's thinking, and that is, you're buying a team. Biden's advisors, Biden's appointments, Biden's plans and strategies, that's what I'm buying into, more than just the guy or the woman. And the reality is that we've seen Biden's plan, and we've seen Trump's plan. Trump's plan is to have Kushner and his daughter and his 2 sons and Steve Bannon and Diamond and Silk and the Alex Jones. Yeah, it's so just to that. I'll wrap up, but that's my point. I think you buy a team on some level. I wish more was made of that.
You do, and I think it's reasonable to be tough on Biden about things like, does he really want to keep some of the people he's appointed at this point? He kept a number of Trump people. He kept Christopher Wray, for example, at the FBI, who shut down, while Trump was president, a huge operation to look for money laundering by Middle East terrorists. And nobody has explained this yet and why it was done. I mean, you can imagine why, given the $2 billion given to Jared Kushner, that there was something corrupt about this, but it has not been reinstated. And perhaps Mayorkas, the Homeland Security Secretary. But you're right, you buy a team. And overall, his team is like Biden. Biden is the first president we've had since LBJ with a really deep knowledge of how to make Washington work. And I discount Jerry Ford because he was there for 2.5 years, the only non-elected president. So he didn't have some big agenda. But, we had all these outsiders. I mean, Barack Obama basically got elected to the U.S. Senate thanks to Jerry Ryan, the actress, and had a cup of coffee and became president of the United States. George W. Bush had been out of the country, I think, twice for 5 minutes in his entire life. Here we have someone who was chairman for years of the Senate Foreign Affairs Committee, who stared down Milosevic and said, knock the genocide off or you're going to die in prison. And lo and behold, that's what happened. And he's in prison. And I can't remember at the moment if he's died yet. But, it was a very brave thing to do. Milosevic and his people, they could have killed Biden. And he confronted him face to face. And Biden has produced incredible economic benefits. Inflation has fallen by 2/3. A lot of prices are still high, but gasoline is down. I just did a piece this morning for someone, and gasoline is down more than $1 a gallon. Eggs are down significantly. Chicken's been flat. Hamburger is up, but it's up 3% from the peak in 2022. The number of jobs is just incredible that are being created. Even if you just say, well, replacing all the Trump jobs he doesn't get any credit for. Okay. Why anybody would think that was automatic, I don't know. But let's assume that even then, the job creation numbers continue to be terrific. And wages are rising for the bottom 90%, which hasn't happened for a long time, decades.
It's interesting, David, you talk about the holdovers from the Trump administration. Let me just bring one up to you and you review for us someone who, was so prominent in the news for a while, but now has faded, but I think still has a very important role, and that's the Postmaster General, Louis DeJoy. Explain why he seemed committed to dismantling the post office and privatizing the post office. That's always the goal, it would seem, of the GOP, is to privatize everything from the military to the post office. And why couldn't he be replaced? It's an interesting aspect of the way government works.
Well, the Postal Service, which is authorized by the Constitution but not required, is a federal corporation. And Biden does not directly control the Postal Commissioner. The Postal Commissioner's appointment is by the board of the United States Postal Service. And in the beginning, he couldn't do anything about it because there was a Trump majority. There's now a Biden majority. And why he hasn't gotten rid of Louis DeJoy, I don't know. Nobody in journalism in Washington has raised this issue about why does Biden hang on to certain people? Probably because the political cost of getting someone new run through the Postal Service isn't worth leaving them in place and controlling and limiting them. And that would be the most.
It's funny, David. I agree. I was sort of with this notion that, and this is why I call him an institutionalist. I think he's just so loath to shake things up. But he's dealing in a time now, and I understand the fact that he's this legacy politician, that he's been around so long, has allowed him to do some of the things you've talked about, like broker infrastructure deal and make some of these deals across the aisle. I mean, even as thin a majority it is. But it also gives him this bias toward not wanting to, rock the boat too much, the boat of Washington. And I don't know that does, does just causes it doesn't give them their due often, is what I would say. I want to ask you about something off the politics of Biden and Trump and all of that, because you've written extensively about the wealthy class and about the tax code and about the way the wealthy class can exploit the tax code. Essentially, it's been written for exploitation by the wealthy class. In Vermont, there is legislation being introduced this week that would impose new taxes on the state's wealthiest residents. That's a growing national campaign being pushed by Democrats who think that measures will gain traction as states reckon with post-pandemic budget squeezes. One proposal in Vermont would tax people with more than $10 million in net worth on their capital gains, even if the gains have not yet been realized. Another would add a 3% marginal tax on individual incomes exceeding $500,000 a year, a measure that supporters contend could pump $98 million, almost 5% of the annual budget, into Vermont's coffers. Can you speak to this? It's a growing trend nationwide.
Well, first of all the surveys are showing support for some kind of tax on super wealthy people. That's not 500,000. That's like 5 million up, or maybe like Larry Ellison, who collects $5 million a day just in dividends from Oracle. The polls generally show ratios like 82% for, 7% against, 91% for, 3% against. It's overwhelming in all of these. Now, any proposal for a wealth tax on unrealized gains, that is stocks you haven't sold or businesses you haven't sold, that's not going to go anywhere. And it won't work for a very simple reason. Except for stocks, we don't have good ways to measure the value of things. How much is my house worth, or someone's hotel business worth? And there are lots of ways to manipulate that. But on realized income, your salary, your bonus, your stock options, your cashing in securities to sell them, that's quite easy to measure. And those, I think, you're going to see start happening around the country. And let's remember, there's a guy about to be sentenced who leaked these IRS files to ProPublica and others, showing that the Jeff Bezos and Elon Musk and a bunch of other multi-billionaires often pay no federal income tax or very little. And the reason is they borrow against their assets. And there's clear public disgust with this. Younger people overwhelmingly are in support of both Biden and a reform of our tax system that levies people with very high incomes. And the top 1% income in America starts at about $600,000. If you're making $600,000, that's $50,000 a month before taxes, you're doing pretty well. Nobody needs to feel badly for you. But we shouldn't confuse those people who are overwhelmingly two-income couples with high-paying jobs. A partner in a law firm married to a partner in an accounting firm. A surgeon in a hospital married to a school district superintendent. Those kind of relationships. Those people, the data show, have surprisingly little capital. Almost all their savings is in their retirement plans. So they have only labor income. It's the people who are making $2 million and up, and especially the ones who have $2 million and up in capital income, dividends, capital gains from selling shares, certain kinds of royalties, like if you own an oil well. When I was very young, my first wife used to get a check every 90 days for like $11 for her share of some oil well, and we filled out her tax return and we listed her occupation as oil baroness. Eventually, the oil ran out after the checks got down to like $1 a month, $1 a quarter.
Wow. Yeah, you're hoping for a late inning rally on that $11 a month. Maybe that oil well, So you see this as increasingly a campaign that has momentum, a tax on the super wealthy.
Yes.
And just a question.
I think Reaganism and Trumpism is a sort of evil extension of that. And I do use that word deliberately because Trump, maintains he can commit crimes. He can kill people if he's president. Reaganism and its evil child Trumpism, I think, have run their course in America. If you were a millennial, if you were born in the late 90s, the early 2000s, you look around at the world and what have you seen growing up? Gee, when you're in grammar school, the economy collapsed, and if your parents didn't lose their jobs in their home, kids whose parents did around you. By some measures, the 2008 recession was more damaging to American families than the Great Depression, which started in 29, went on until 35, sort of stopped for a year and a half or 2 years, and then resumed for a while. But worse than that, in terms of the damage it did to family wealth. And, we have this crazy notion that you're supposed to borrow money to go to college because we're asking the wrong question about education. The question we should be asking is, how much education do we need to produce an enduring, stable, informed society, not how are we going to pay for college? I mean, I always ask my students, I say, by the way, how many of you have been solicited this year for kindergarten insurance? They look at me and I say, come on, there must be people all over campus trying to sell kindergarten insurance. After all, you're college students. You are known to engage in behaviors that are likely to lead to a need for kindergarten. And then I go, oh, that's right. We provide that through the tax system because we want to have educated adults. Well, why are we not deciding how many years of education we need and providing for it that way? Going back to when I went to college in California, the first year I paid in today's money $200, of which $120 was for a parking permit. That's in today's money. $200 for the year, $120 for a parking permit, $90 for student fees, student association fees, and now it's thousands and thousands, tens of thousands of dollars.
Tens of thousands, yeah.
Yeah, and we have all these people. I just ran into someone, a doctor, at went to see this great movie, American Fiction, which is heartwarming and wonderful and thoughtful. I encourage people to see it.
That's what we're hearing. It's a perfect movie, yeah.
And there were two doctors I know from when our daughters were in Girl Scouts who were there, and finally, at age 50, they paid off their student loans. It's crazy. That's
scandalous. I mean, it's scandalous in the developed world that's our situation. But alas, it is. David, I love our time together. Thank you for being so generous with it. And I will, if we have any specific comments, we go through in after hours trading in comments. I will call and offer them to you, and we'll respond to them next week.
We'll see what happens in New Hampshire come next week.
Yeah, exactly. There's a lot to talk
Take
about.
care.
David K. Johnston, everybody. Hi, it's Mark, and I thought that was great. Hit the notification bell. You'll know whenever there's a new video being dropped, and please subscribe to our channel to help us save the universe.